Hello and welcome back to State of the Division, this time bringing you UFC 307. And honestly, this feels like a much needed breath of fresh air. It feels like an exciting card with some fun fights loaded top to bottom, all worth checking out. I mean, Spann versus St. Preux is a super interesting fight for me. Thompson, Buckley, it's a great sort of litmus test for both fighters. Is Thompson still in that upper echelon? Is Buckley up in that upper echelon now? We're going to find out. Holland's always a fun fighter to have on the card, and Dolidze looks to be an interesting challenge, and this is sort of the proving ground for him, I feel. And this isn't mentioning the two title fights. Pennington, Pena looks to be interesting, two ground-focused fighters with different approaches to going at it. Not to mention the Pereira Rountree fight looks to be a lot of fun. Two guys that both like finishing, but go about it with either raw power or a more beautiful destruction, if you even want to call it that, for Pereira. Overall, I think 307 might be one of the better cards of the year. It's obviously not going to beat a UFC 300 or a UFC 301, but I think this might be up there in an argument for one of the better cards of the year. Obviously, it's way too early to say that, but let's get into the housekeeping butcher's bill before we take a look at these fights. For housekeeping, I had my worst card ever last time. I went 4-6. Literally, if I'd gotten one right, I would have been 500, but no. For the first time in doing this, I feel, I have a losing record on a card. And it brings my own overall record to 75, 48, and 2, not that you can read it on the board. Now, 100 is basically lost at this point. There's not a snowball's chance in hell unless I'm perfect on every card going out of here. Which does hurt a little because I deluded myself into believing I could get to like 98 or something. However, given my catastrophic failure on that last card, I feel like I need to justify myself and kind of go about what I recognize that I did wrong. So, the three picks I really went wrong with, that at least I've gone back and looked at my script and looked at my notes and what I've gotten to. Ortega is a fight that I did wrong, but I don't regret. I probably could have easily picked Lopez to win. I think Lopez was the smart pick. Ortega was a bit of my, this is my heart leading me, not my brain, but also I felt like Ortega had the best chance for an upset, and I felt like Ortega was going into that fight wanting to prove something. Was that the best basis to judge a fight? No, but at least I did acknowledge that Lopez had a very good chance to win, and I was a bit leading with my heart there. The other two, I don't have much good justification. Truthfully, I don't know why I picked Grasso besides being the slight Vegas favorite or whatever. Looking back over my script, all I remember is that I was very much writing this, I was a bit against the clock writing this script. I remember I was thoroughly fed up with writing that section because it had a few rewrites for me, and I think that was just me being done with the card, because I don't see any reason in the world why I picked Grasso besides being thoroughly done with it. I remember recording it and being done with the recording and my flimsy justification being, well, Grasso seems to have her number, and being done with it immediately thinking, why did I pick Grasso? And I just had to hope it worked out because I wasn't going to go back and re-record. It was going to be right that take, and I was deciding live for that fight. So Shevchenko should have been my pick, and I think any other thing I was looking at told me Shevchenko was, but for some stupid reason I just picked Grasso, and I really do think I was thoroughly done with writing that fight and just wanted to be done with it, much less that recording. O'Malley's a different story. I picked O'Malley to win, and truthfully, if you had asked me after that recording, or even a day before I recorded, I would have probably picked Merab. You can believe me or not believe me, that's fair enough. But in my head, what really went down was that I continuously picked against O'Malley up until that Cheeto fight. And I think in this card, I got in my head like, all right, I've picked against O'Malley every other time. Let's pick for him. We saw what he did to Aldo. We saw what he did there. We saw how he negated his ability to get in and get close. That's something he can do to Merab, right? And I conflated the takedown styles of Sterling with Merab, and that's not something I should have done. It wasn't a great way to look at that fight at all, because Merab's style is so completely different from how Sterling goes about takedowns. Merab's high-paced attempts, high-paced putting you against the cage, and simply keeps you on the back foot. Sterling gets you down and holds you down while he maneuvers and holds that control time. The two styles are very different, and their approach to them is different. And that put O'Malley on the back foot more, having to constantly defend an onslaught of takedowns. And once he's on the ground, I knew O'Malley didn't have a great ground game, but I overinflated his reach advantage as being something that would matter more to a guy like Merab. I shouldn't have done that, and that truthfully those are my two biggest mistakes. I think were calling it for Grasso off I think, just a piss poor attitude writing that fight, and calling her for O'Malley based off my past decisions all being wrong except for one, and finally deciding to give a guy his flowers on the worst possible fight to give a guy his flowers. That being said, we do have a butcher's bill to get to, and thankfully, it's a small one. Aljamain Sterling and Movsar Evelev are both off this card. I don't exactly remember who was injured, but I believe it was Sterling that had to pull out, and they could not get an opponent for Evelev in time to keep him on the card. He was pulled, and I believe this fight was replaced with Hubbard versus Hernandez, which we will get to when we get there, because it's not worth talking about. But with all that out of the way, and my poor flimsy justifications for sucking on the last card, let's get into the early prelims. 21-13, Court the Crusher McGee opens the card up against 33-16, 1-1, Tim the Dirty Bird Means. McGee is a year younger at 39. Means takes 3 inches in height with dead even reach across the board. McGee is an older hand in the UFC, his first fight in 2010, and his most recent on August 6 against Alex Morono. Now, he is on a cold streak as of late with 3 straight losses, 2 by KO and 1 by decision. Stylistically, McGee is a control-focused fighter who relies on stacking takedowns and racking up control time. On that note, here's a 1.84 takedown average, which does highlight how his takedown game can be limited or shut down completely by some opponents, but when possible, he will land multiple and rack the control time up by that way. In the striking, he works a solid, but not great, 4.50 to 3.52. Does tend to take the striking lead in his wins, but the overall striking total in his wins isn't very high, so I will say he wants to slow the fight down and keep it in his wheelhouse. Means is a bird of a similar feather. His first fight in 2012 and a fight this year, 2024, April 27th. He's also coming off a loss against Uros Medic by KO, which does play into his striking-focused style with some disruptive takedowns sprinkled in. Not always the focus of the fight. Now, numbers-wise, in the striking, carries a 5.08 to 3.54 and does have a tendency to get into and just swing with fighters, which has led to him getting caught before, not surprising. Now, in terms of finish power, it's very iffy. His most recent win by knockout being September 2023. But on the same hand, that was his first finish win since 2019. Helping out that striking is a 1.16 takedown average, which shows up fairly consistently for about 2 minutes of ground control when he manages to land it. But as I said earlier, it isn't something he necessarily needs to get a win. To start this off, Vegas has Means by a decent margin, and I will agree with the money counters here. McGee is riding a cold hand, which kind of counts against him, and he seems to struggle against power punchers like Matt Brown and Jeremiah Wells. And Means has shown the tendency to pull that power a little more, and I think in this fight that gives him the more advantage. He's the slightly hotter hand versus a cold hand who struggles with finishers and power punchers. I wouldn't call Means the ultimate power puncher, but he definitely has that power he can call on. 19-7, Carla Cookie Monster Esparza looks for the rebound against 13-7 Tesha the Tiny Tornado, Pennington, or Torres, depending on the site you look at. Pennington is 1 year younger at 35, even height, and 3 whole inches in reach, rolling to Esparza. Esparza is coming off a title fight loss to Zhang Weili, so it's a little confusing why she's on the early prelims of this card, but as a whole is very much a control-focused fighter with an emphasis on the ground game with a 3.22 takedown average and at least a takedown landed in every one of her wins and most of her losses, honestly. But with controlling the fight as she does, the striking, in her wins at least, doesn't tend to have high totals. I mean, total combined significant strikes in her last 3 wins. 67 total strikes in a unanimous decision win, 32 in a KO win, and 73 in a split decision win. And with that, both decision wins had her down in strikes by a small margin. And you kind of see that continue on the feet with her 2.16 to 2.69 average. It's not too surprising given the ground focus, but with that reliance on takedowns, there's a problem when her game gets negated or her opponent takes the initiative and controls that ground game. Pennington/Torres is a bit of a different take. Stylistically, she's more of a striking-focused grinder with a 4.78 to 3.59 in the numbers, which does show that she can be beat out on the feet, but that hasn't happened since 2019 against Marina Rodriguez. Now, she does have some sort of takedown game at a 0.61, but it's very inconsistent. And she has also struggled with some opponents who shoot takedowns, with her 65% takedown defense. The nod goes to Pennington Torres by a narrow margin here, and I think I'm gonna disagree. Esparza is coming off a title fight, which I think is a bonus in her favor, and I think she has the clearer path to victory. She has a takedown-heavy style and ability to control the position, something she does very well. And the random flashes of finishability add another threat. And while you see that Pennington Torres is able to sometimes counter that, someone like Esparza I think is going to be able to take her down and control the position long enough to simply take the fight by decision that way. And we've seen Pennington Torres struggle with that before in some of her other fights where she's been outclassed on the feet and hasn't been able to take the control on the ground, or she's been outclassed on the ground and isn't able to get to the feet. Something we've seen Esparza do to some other fighters. Ending off our early prelims, what feels like fairly early. 21 and 10. Ryan, Superman Spann, squares up with 27 and 17. Ovince, OSP, St. Preux. Spann is 8 years younger at 33, 2 inches taller with 1 inch in reach, rolling to St. Preux. Now Spann is coming off 3 losses, 2 by finish, 1 by split decision, and stylistically comes across as very much a kill or be killed fighter, with 6 of his 8 wins being by finish. Stylistically, he has a bit of a finisher stat line, a 325 to 389 in striking, which does show how he can be outpaced in the fight and does rely on the finish to win more often than not. Does have a takedown game with a 1.34 average, but I'm tentative to call it consistent even though he can generate chunks of control time with it. He doesn't always shoot the takedown and tends to work the feet more, but has proven the ability to survive the ground game of his opponents and even counter it with a submission. St. Preux is an odd duck and really hard to get a handle on, but if I'm gonna try, I'd call him a kill or be killed finisher who occasionally wins by decision. He does trend more towards staying on the feet with a 3.03 to 3.02 in the striking, which does show that in his losses he does get outstruck badly, but wins takes a solid striking lead, rarely blowing them out, but just being ahead by enough. I wouldn't call him a power puncher, but it's more of a swarming style that hits you a lot and rocks you. This is backed up with a submission game and a 1.10 takedown average. Now the takedowns are definitely situational and matchup based, as well as the submissions being opportunity based, or something I feel he hunts for at any given opportunity. Favorite here is Spann by a good margin, and honestly I'm pretty torn. Spann is a kill or be killed fighter with power in spades and submission ability, but St. Preux is good at changing the pace of a fight to be one in his wheelhouse, but struggles with getting finished in turn. So I'm gonna agree with Vegas, and I'm gonna pick Spann. A little tentatively, I feel, but I'm going to pick him. Because I think that his ability to finish a fight and his power give him the slightest edge versus St. Preux, who we've seen struggle with getting finished as of late if he can't control the pace of the fight well enough. If he takes control early, I think this is St. Preux all the way, but I think Spann has a chance to come out hot and land early hits and take control of momentum that way, preventing St. Preux from executing his game plan. This one feels closer than Vegas has it, honestly, but I am going to agree on the Spann in the end. Kicking off the prelims. Relative newcomer, 5-1, Cecilia Almeida, looks for the rebound win against 20-6 Ihor, the duelist Potieria. Potieria is 8 years younger, 2 inches taller, with only 1 inch in reach, rolling his way. Now, Almeida only has 2 actual UFC fights and 1 contender series, but across those, he's very much been a high-octane striker, rocking a 4.25 to 1.88 with 4 career KO wins. He has outstruck his opponent in all 3 of his fights, only getting the finish against Dylan Budka so far. He does have no takedowns on record in the UFC, however he was able to generate 5 minutes and 43 seconds of control time against Lucas Fernando. Worth noting, he has been taken down multiple times in each of his fights, being forced to overcome the takedowns against Budka, and not being able to against Roman Koplyov. Potieria looks like a kill or be killed fighter with a focus on the feet, since all but one of his UFC fights have ended by finish. The 5.13 to 5.04 in striking shows how he tends to wade in and trade, with it not working out for him a lot of the time given his UFC record. When it comes to takedowns, he doesn't tend to shoot and carries a 57% takedown defense, and has been taken down a handful of times for 2 to 4 minutes of ground control. The heavy favorite here is Almeida, and I think I will agree. This is another fight that's really hard for me to get a read on, and it feels like a little bit of a toss-up. Both fighters like to strike on the feet, both fighters are kill or be killed-ish, but I'm going to give it to Almeida simply because we've seen him find that power a bit more often. He's found the top end in the striking exchange more recently, and Potieria struggled with coming out on top in exchanges. He's waded in more, gotten hit more, and been on the wrong side of the power more. I don't expect this fight to go to the ground, so on the feet, I'm giving the slightest of edges to Almeida and kind of relying on Vegas a little here. The late addition to the card, and I want to guess the replacement for Sterling Evelev. 16-7, Austin Thud Hubbard looks for 2 in a row against 14-8, Alexander the Great Ape Hernandez. Even age across the board at 32, 1 inch of height going to Hubbard, with reach being 1 inch, to Hernandez. Hubbard is a control-focused fighter who makes use of his power to secure takedowns and keep his opponent's offense limited while peppering strikes to keep people cautious. He's a bit streaky, going from win to loss to win, but getting to the numbers, he rolls a 4.11 to 3.74 in striking. Functional striking style lets him use his power and set up the takedowns and control side of his game. Speaking of control, he works a 1.75 takedown average, and it acts a consistent part in almost all of his fights, though it has been turned against him, resulting in submission losses before. Hernandez is a bit more of a finisher, but has struggled to find consistent success in the UFC. Tends to get into exchanges more often, leading to a 4.33 to 4.66 in striking, which has resulted in a handful of finished losses, and losses where he was just simply outpaced from the get-go. There is some finishability, but once again, it's inconsistent. Takedown game is there as a backup at 1.06, but isn't a reliable aspect of his game or too successful to really consider here. Vegas likes Hubbard by a narrow margin, and I think I will agree. Neither fighter has too much going for him here in terms of the numbers or wins, but I feel like Hubbard has been the one to find more of a consistent identity, or as much as he can with how the streaky kind of style he's been, and the way he fights is just more identifiable, if you will. It might be the wrong word, versus what we see Hernandez doing. I think Hubbard has a style and a game plan that he's going to be able to execute versus Hernandez, who's really struggled to get his footing going. 17, 4, and 2. Marina Rodriguez takes the octagon against 16 and 5. Yasmin Lucindo. Lucindo is 15 years younger at 22. Holy crap. Rodriguez takes either 2 or 3 inches in height depending on the site you look at, with reach being a whole inch in favor of Lucindo. Rodriguez is somewhat of a rounded fighter, capable of finishing the fight, but more often than not goes for more of a control style, taking it the distance and getting the decision win. Striking wise, she carries a 4.82 to 3.12, which does show that her striking is more often than not efficient and capable of letting her build a sizable lead in some of her fights. 144 to 46 in 2021 against Mackenzie Dern. She also has never really outpaced too badly on the feet in her losses. Knockouts are another story, however, but tends to struggle with takedowns. She only carries a 23% average with a 65% takedown defense and has been taken down in each of her last 4 fights, losing 3 of them. I don't know fully if the change in takedown effectiveness is just the matchups or a change in game plan. Lucindo only has 4 UFC fights so far, but I would say she's more of a ground-focused grinder with some submission ability. UFC-wise, she runs with a 2.23 takedown average and has at least 2 takedowns in each of her UFC wins. And backing that all up is an effective striking base of 395 to 311, which is a pretty standard grappling striking style. Vegas likes Lucindo by a narrow margin, and I think I'm going to agree here. Yes, Rodriguez has a shot. Rodriguez has been able to win fights before and been able to win tight fights, but she struggles with the takedown. She has a 0.23 average and a 65% defense against someone like Lucindo, who wants to shoot the takedown, who wants to go to the ground, who wants to grind you on the ground. And we've seen Rodriguez struggle with that. If Rodriguez can't overcome Lucindo's takedown, I think it goes to Lucindo. And as it stands, I think Lucindo's takedowns are going to be the deciding factor, and I think that gives Lucindo more paths to win. Ending off the prelims, 17, 7, and 1. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson looks for the bounce-back win against the rolling 19 and 6 Joaquin Numanza Buckley. Buckley is 11 years younger, either 2 or 4 inches shorter, with reach being a single inch heading Buckley's way. Thompson is a UFC veteran and a striker through and through. He was a finisher for the longest time, but as of recent hasn't had that consistent KO touch, so I'd call him more of a striking grinder. Only one of his last 5 wins being a KO win. Worth noting is he doesn't really get finished, with only 1 finished loss in his last 6 fights. Numbers-wise, works a 4.11 to 3.03, which doesn't exactly highlight his very measured style where he tends to avoid most of the damage coming back at him, at least in his wins. But it does show he's able to hang on the feet in most of his fights, never really getting left behind. Now, he does struggle with takedowns, as wrestling-focused fighters have been very successful as him as of late, though he was able to survive the ground and overcome the takedowns against Kevin Holland. Buckley is very much a finisher with a definite preference for the feet. In the numbers, he has a 4.25 to 3.12 in striking, which does show how he's able to build that striking lead, but can't always completely pull away from his competition. That is where his power and dynamic striking style come into play and helps be the ultimate difference maker. Behind all that is a sneakily effective takedown game that he can pull on with a 1.69 average. But in the last 3 fights that he had a takedown, he landed 2 or more with varying amounts of control time across them. Vegas' favorite is Buckley, and while it's boring, I'm going to agree. I was debating this for a while, and Thompson, as a striker, has a chance. If this fight stays on the feet the entire time, I might give it to him. But seeing how Buckley has recently been shooting takedowns more, and while he hasn't been the most incredibly effective takedown artist, against someone like Thompson who has a record of struggling against it, and once he's on the ground and being controlled, we've seen him struggle against other fighters, I'm assuming that Buckley's going to be able to land some takedowns and take a few rounds, and I don't know if Thompson's going to be able to finish him as of late, as he hasn't had that KO touch. So if Buckley's able to get him down and control him, and having that aspect of his game, it tilts the needle in favor of Buckley more for me than it does Thompson. Obviously, if this fight never goes to the ground, I think this fight's closer to dead even, but with those takedowns in play, I'm going to pick Buckley. Kicking off the main card. 13-3, Roman, the Caucasian Dolidze, wins worst ring name and squares up with 26-11-0-1. Kevin, the Trailblazer, Holland. Holland is 5 years younger at 31, either dead even height or 1 inch in Holland's favor, with 5 inches of reach definitely heading to Holland. Dolidze is a little weird to describe, but I think my best bet is to say that he's a finisher with solid power and an effective ground game. 4 of his last 7 wins coming by finish. He does tend to focus on the feet when he fights, and several times has been forced to come from behind to win. You see that with his 3.13 to 3.37 averages in striking. Power acting as that great equalizer and keeping him in a fight even when he begins to trail in the numbers. Behind that is a solid ground game that, while not always used, is something that when he calls on, gets him a solid few minutes of control and disruption. He has struggled with being taken down in fights with a 33% takedown defense, though worth noting he has won most of the fights in which he was taken down. Holland is Holland, and by that I mean he's a killer-be-killed fighter with finishing power in spades and a solid submission game lurking in the wings. Rocks a 4.25 to 3.20 on the feet, and with the aforementioned power being a major threat of that. Also seen with those numbers is the fact that he isn't generally being severely outstruck in his losses, with most of them being relatively close. Doesn't seem to have much of a takedown game with a .84 average, but he's able to play well off his opponent's attempts or play off his back to take control. Holland is the narrow favorite of this fight, and I will agree. I can't really count Dolidze out, as when fighters get to swinging, anything can happen, but Holland does have the more consistent power recently. Holland is more of a knockout artist, I will say. Dolidze does only have a 33% takedown defense, and while Holland doesn't shoot often, when he does shoot, they can be very effective in swinging around his way, or even giving him time to set up a ground and pound. I think Dolidze can win if it's on the feet. When 2 fighters get to swinging, anything is possible. But I think in turn, Holland has the advantage in terms of his power, his striking style, and we've seen him go up against, I think, some higher level competition than Dolidze has. 14-3, Ketlin Fenomeno Vieira takes on UFC newcomer 17-1 Kayla Harrison. Vieira is 1 year younger, either 1 inch taller or no difference in height, with reach being 2 inches in favor to Vieira. Vieira is a grinder through and through who thrives on taking the fight down to the ground and racking up chunks of control time with just good enough striking most of the takedown average sits at a 1.51, is a pretty consistent through line in all her wins but one of them. And while she does have submission ability, it's not something we have seen landed recently at all. And as seen with these control fighters, their striking is really just good enough, a 304 to 392 in her case. Lets her just hang in there with her opponents but never really take the lead. I mean, she has only taken the striking lead once in her UFC fights. Harrison is going into her second UFC fight, but is coming off a solid run in the PFL. In her one UFC fight, she looked like an all-rounder, capable of working the feet or the ground to good effect, and her overall record kind of helps show this, with 6 career KO wins and 7 submission wins. Definitely worth noting is her successful, or very successful career, I should say, as a judoka, which brings in a very strong dynamic for her takedown and ground game. Harrison is also a big and strong for this weight division, which definitely helps her control parts of the fight. By a heavy margin, Harrison is the favorite. I'm talking minus 1,200 to plus 750, and I'm inclined to agree. My reasoning for agreeing is that Vieira likes going to the ground, which is where Harrison kind of wants to go and be in control. Now, if Vieira can take control, great, but we've seen Harrison be able to reverse position or get back to the feet as well. And if both fighters want to go to the ground, I think Harrison has the size and strength advantage, if you will, in this fight to either reverse the position or counter and turn it into her takedown, getting her on top of Vieira. And in that case, I think Vieira is on the back foot. All that together, that's why I'm picking Harrison. 32-8, Jose Jr. Aldo squares off against 14-2 Mario Bautista. Bautista is 7 years younger, 2 inches taller, with a whopping single inch of reach, going to Aldo. Aldo is a 16-year veteran of the UFC or the WEC, and a bona fide living legend. But to actually talk about him stylistically, Aldo has become a well-rounded grinder as of late. Well, 2020 for being honest, but still. He does tend to favor the feet and is able to outpace his opponents on the feet or at worst, match them. He does have 17 career KOs, but his last KO win was in 2019. You see all this in the numbers with a 3.63 to 3.73, and while I did say his KO power has been lacking, he has been able to touch fighters up and make them respect it a little bit. Ground game is odd to talk about as he doesn't shoot all that often, averaging 0.51 takedowns per 15 minutes, but all that being said, he's been able to counter opponent takedowns and take control, or when he does land, he's able to generate a chunk of control time, though even now it's not the focus focus of his game. Bautista is more of a finisher with a definite focus on submissions and getting the fight down to the ground. Those last two fights both saw it going to the judges. Now the focus on the ground shows up big with a 2.25 takedown average and at least one takedown in 6 of his 10 UFC fights. Admittedly, the control time does tend to vary fight to fight and seems to depend on the opponent. Striking is good with a 5.69 to 3.99, and in his last fight against Ricky Simon, we saw him lean heavily on the striking in order to get the win. Additionally, seems to be a fairly dynamic striking style, able to mix in knees with his general athleticism. Surprisingly, Vegas has this close, which I did not expect. I expected it to be heavy to Bautista, and it is to Bautista by a much more narrow margin. And I know earlier in this video I complained about my long shots with Ortega and Lopez, but I'm going with Aldo here. I don't think Bautista is out of this fight. I think Bautista has a definite chance to win, but even Vegas has this fight close. And I think Aldo is a big jump in competition for Bautista. And Bautista's coming at Aldo. He's going to try to shoot the takedown, but if he gets stuck on the feet, I think he's at a very large disadvantage. So this fight has to go to the ground. But we've seen Aldo defend the ground or survive the ground and get back to the feet where he wants to be. So I think Bautista has to excel in the ground game, but Aldo has experience facing ground-heavy fighters and sometimes coming out on top or making them work for the win. And I think he can make Bautista work, and the longer Bautista works, the more chances Aldo has to win this fight, I feel. Yes, that's a little bit of a long shot, but I'm hard-pressed to pick against Jose Aldo a lot of the time. For the co-main event in the women's bantamweight title, 16-8, Raquel "Rocky" Pennington looks for her first title defense against the former champion, 11-5, Juliana the Venezuelan Vixen Pena. Pena is 1 year younger, either a dead draw in height or a single inch rolling to Pennington, but Pena taking a definite 2 inches in reach. Pennington is a grinder capable of controlling the fight on the feet or racking up control time on the ground. Does tend to try to stay on the feet with a 4.14 to 3.19 in striking, building up solid striking leads by limiting her opponent's offense. She can be outpaced on the feet, not that it happens often, but when it does, she's able to lean on her takedown and control game to kind of counteract that. Takedown average does only sit at a .90, which shows she doesn't shoot/land often, but is able to work off her opponent's attempts and switch position in order to take those chunks of control time back. There is some semblance of a submission game with 2 attempted in her last fight, but hasn't actually landed one since 2021. Pena is more of a finisher, but shares a similar preference for going to the ground, where she tends to end it there. Aforementioned takedown sits at a 1.94 average, and given that she tends to finish, 1 takedown is all she needs at time. Worth noting is that she can be taken down, and fighters are able to take the control time lead from her. Now, she is able to finish, which will win her those fights, but it is still a trend worth noting. On the feet, she is a fine 3.16 to 2.30, which shows up in how she takes the striking lead in her wins and holds on to it. The lead never seems to be too high, but given that she tends to finish, that's not too surprising. Vegas has it close, but gives the nod to Pennington. And I think I will agree. Admittedly, I agonized over this fight writing it, and I almost wrote Decide live. But the reason I'm going with Pennington is that we have seen some fighters take control of the ground game from Pena and not let her get it going. And while I don't quite know what echelon of ground game fighter to put Pennington at, I think Pennington is good enough to either prevent Pena from taking control or survive Pena on the ground and force her to go the distance, which is Pennington's game. On the feet, I think these fighters match up pretty evenly, and I think Pennington's style gives her the edge there, controlling the flow, putting pressure on, and just racking up the points, which I think when this fight goes 5 rounds is an advantage to her. So in the end, I'm going with Pennington. For the main event in the light heavyweight belt, defending champion 11-2, Alex Poatan Pereira looks for his 3rd defense against 13-5, 0-1, Khalil the Warhorse Rountree. Rountree is 3 years younger, 3 inches shorter, with 3 inches of reach going to Pereira. I feel like I'm running out of creative ways to describe Pereira, but he is a striker capable of putting you away in any round. Striking style is very explosive and dynamic, mixing in kicks and elbows, forcing opponents to watch their angles and constantly be wary. Also able to work his reach very well, minimizing damage coming back his way, while also being able to bring his power out with solid consistency. In the numbers, he racks a 5.23 to 3.51, which does show that sort of measured style where he avoids a lot of damage. In terms of a ground game, there isn't a whole lot of talk. 0.17 average, and the last landed takedown was against Israel Adesanya in 2022. He's proven the ability to defend and survive takedowns, as seen against Jan Blachowicz and his first fight against Yuri Prochazka. Rountree is similar in theory, not so much in the application. He is a finisher and a straight-up striker, but he's much more willing to swing and bang with his opponents than Pereira is. The 3.84 to 4.18 shows that he likes to let his power beat equalizer and how he will have to come from behind at times, though he has been up to that task. And much like Pereira, he doesn't really shoot takedowns and doesn't like going to the ground. As such, he has struggled when taken down, but I don't imagine that's much of a factor in this fight. For the main event, Vegas runs with Pereira, and I'm going to agree. Yes, it's like a little bit of a cop-out, and this fight I think is really close. Because I think when you get two guys who like to swing, two guys who have the power, and two guys who have the finish, this fight can go either way in a heartbeat. But looking at the two fighters, Pereira hits and gets hit less. That gives him the advantage in my mind. It's a more measured style, it works the range pretty well, and while Rountree can bring the power and end it in a snap, I think Pereira's ability to kind of measure the distance, work a little more methodically, will keep him out of harm's way a lot of the time. Obviously, Rountree can close the distance and take it. I don't believe takedowns are going to matter in this fight. But I think Pereira has an arsenal and the ability to face other dangerous fighters like Rountree, at least a little bit like him, really. That he'll be able to manage him as best as he can to minimize most of the damage and keep himself as safe as he can be. All that being said, that was UFC 307. And I hope you agree, it's a surprisingly fun card. I didn't hear a lot about this card until I started writing the script, and I was surprised by the depth of the card, honestly. You have a lot of fun fights on it, and even the fights that are boring are kind of litmus test or fighters fighting to kind of prove, hey, I deserve to be here. I think from top to bottom, you're getting a lot of prove-it fights. Both title fights are really good with people being former challengers, people who are up in the rankings and think they deserve a shot. You have a former title challenger on the early prelims for crying out loud on this card. I think UFC 307 really is a loaded card. I'm hoping it delivers on my high expectations, although knowing me, I might not be so lucky. All that being said, thank you for listening. Go ahead and tell me what you think. And in the end, have a great fight.